The room was quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. Observers had gathered to witness a confrontation they assumed would last, a test of strength and endurance. Within seconds, that expectation dissolved. Bruce Lee stood still for only a moment before the larger opponent faltered, then yielded. No theatrics, no shouting. Just a brief, precise unfolding that left the room in stunned silence. By the time the dust settled, it was clear. Size had yielded to something far less tangible, something measured and deliberate. The outcome was certain before it even began, yet no one could have predicted exactly how it would unfold. The room was small, more hall than arena, yet it had seen its share of challenges. Wooden beams crossed the ceiling, aged and darkened by time, carrying the faint scent of dust and varnish. The floorboards beneath the mats creaked softly with each step, a muted rhythm that seemed almost in tune with the tension in the air. This was not a stage built for spectacle. It was a space of practice, of testing, and of quiet observation. A scattering of spectators had gathered. Some were students of the martial arts, their eyes trained to measure posture, balance, and intent. Others were casual witnesses, drawn by curiosity, aware that something unusual was about to unfold. Whispers passed between them, careful, almost hesitant, acknowledging a collective anticipation, though no one spoke loudly. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. The mats were worn, the edges slightly frayed, bearing the imprint of countless footsteps, falls, and controlled movements. In one corner, a bench held water bottles and towels, unremarkable but present, silent witnesses to the countless hours of practice and the weight of expectation. Light fell unevenly across the space, filtered through high windows, cutting the room into contrasting planes of shadow and illumination. Faces in the audience were partially lit, their expressions caught between curiosity and caution. Every detail, the way a few individuals shifted on their feet, the soft rustle of fabric as hands brushed against knees, added to the atmosphere. It was not an arena built for applause or loud celebration. The silence, punctuated only by these subtle movements, suggested that those present were aware of the gravity of what was about to occur. Even before the challenger arrived, the room seemed attuned to observation rather than performance. This was a place where skill spoke quietly, where reputation preceded action, and where the weight of expectation rested more on presence than on showmanship. Those who knew the rules of the space understood that in moments like these, anticipation was itself a form of participation. When Bruce Lee entered, he did so with the same quiet precision that defined the room. There was no flourish, no attempt to command attention. His movement was measured, the steps deliberate, almost absorbed by the subtle patterns of light and shadow on the mats. Every eye turned, not because he demanded notice, but because the room's equilibrium had shifted imperceptibly. The moment was small, yet unmistakable. Presence alone drew acknowledgement. It required no announcement. The challenger appeared shortly after, a figure larger in stature, exuding the confidence of physical dominance. The contrast was immediate. One calm, composed, precise. The other bold, imposing, expecting to be recognized. Yet the silence of the room did not bend to either. It simply observed, allowing both men to exist within it, each carrying their own measure of authority. By the time both stood facing each other, the room had settled into a tense equilibrium. There were no dramatic gestures, no overt challenge. Just the subtle signs. A shift of weight, a glance across the mat, a soft inhalation of breath. Every spectator felt the undercurrent, that what was about to unfold would not be measured in duration or noise, but in clarity and effect. In these quiet moments, the atmosphere was instructive. Observers unconsciously recognized the rules of engagement. Presence, perception, and patience mattered far more than theatrics. The room itself seemed to condense around the event, a crucible in which something far more decisive than strength alone would soon reveal itself. Even before the first movement there was inevitability. Not in the sense of spectacle, but in the sense of quiet understanding. What was to come would leave a mark, subtle and indelible, on everyone who witnessed it. The mats, the benches, the beams, the scattered audience. They all bore witness to the stillness that preceded mastery. The challenger's presence was immediate. Broad-shouldered, steady of step. He exuded the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to commanding space through sheer size. His eyes swept the room, measuring the spectators, the mats, the boundaries of the hall. He did not yet look at Lee directly, though it was clear his attention would soon settle. Bruce Lee remained still, yet nothing about him was idle. Every line of his body suggested readiness. His gaze scanning the environment without agitation. There was no display of energy, no attempt to assert dominance. In the small movements, a slight adjustment of weight, a subtle tension in the shoulders, he communicated clarity, control, and an understanding of distance. Authority, in this sense, was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable to those who observed closely. The crowd noticed the contrast immediately. One figure commanded by scale and presence, the other by precision and composure. Whispers passed between the spectators, not in excitement, but in calculation. They could see the balance of tension, and they recognized the unusual nature of this meeting. The larger opponent was trained to rely on strength and intimidation. Bruce Lee required neither. The challenger approached with measured steps, an implicit assertion of dominance. Each movement was deliberate, an invitation to acknowledge the expected hierarchy of size. His shadow fell across the mats, momentarily larger than life, and in it, the audience could sense the pressure he intended to impose. Yet Lee did not retreat, nor did he react in overt acknowledgement. His stance was neither defensive nor aggressive. It was simply observant, fluid, and entirely unhurried. In these early moments, a silent negotiation unfolded. The larger man tested boundaries, perhaps unconsciously. A tilt of the head, a step forward, a slight shift in weight. Each gesture sought a reaction. But Lee remained a calm mirror, absorbing and registering without disturbance. There was a subtle but profound psychological effect, an imperceptible assertion of control through stillness and awareness. Those watching could feel it, even if they could not define it. The room seemed to contract around this interaction. Every small detail, how Lee's eyes tracked, how his hands relaxed by his sides, how his weight subtly adjusted, became part of the unspoken conversation between the two men. The larger fighter's confidence, built over years of physical dominance, now faced an unexpected variable. Authority, it seemed, could exist without effort, and presence could outweigh brute force. As the two men faced each other, time stretched imperceptibly. The audience did not see action yet. They saw potential. They sensed the underlying structure of mastery, the quiet calculation, the subtle assessment of leverage, balance, and intent. There was no showmanship. Every motion, every pause carried purpose. Bruce Lee's calm was not passive. It was an active measure of authority, one that imposed itself without a word or gesture. By the end of this chapter, the psychological contrast was clear. One man relied on expectation and physical dominance, confident that size and training guaranteed control. The other relied on observation, precision, and quiet mastery, demonstrating that authority could be measured not in weight, but in clarity and timing. The stage was set. The inevitable confrontation had been framed, not through action, but through presence, and the audience could already sense that what would follow would be less about spectacle and more about understanding the unseen hierarchy of skill. The spectators shifted, almost imperceptibly. Whispers threaded through the room, carried on soft breaths, barely audible but resonant with expectation. The larger man began small tests, subtle gestures meant to gauge response. A step forward, a deliberate inhale, a measured glance at the mats. These movements were almost ceremonial, an unspoken rehearsal of dominance. Bruce Lee remained unmoved. His eyes followed the challenger's motions with calm precision, registering weight distribution, stance, and intent, yet revealing nothing of his own calculation. In his stillness, he created a quiet pressure, one that was not felt physically but mentally, settling like a shadow across the larger man's confidence. The contrast did not go unnoticed by the crowd. Experienced observers recognized it immediately. The larger man relied on expectation, on the assumption that size dictated authority. Lee's presence contradicted that assumption. Every subtle twitch, every controlled breath, demonstrated an understanding beyond sheer strength. The audience could sense that the apparent advantage of mass and muscle was not absolute. It was contingent, fragile in the presence of mastery. The challenger's gestures became slightly more pronounced, a testing of boundaries. He adjusted his weight, raised a shoulder as if to invite a reaction. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, seeking acknowledgement, affirmation that he still commanded the space. The spectators, however, remained silent, caught in a suspended attention. Every movement of Bruce Lee absorbed and neutralized the implied threat without confrontation. The silence amplified the tension. Even in these early exchanges, the psychological pressure was evident. The larger fighter began to hesitate, subtle microsigns betraying uncertainty. A brief pause in motion, a flicker of awareness in the eyes, a momentary shift in stance. The audience sensed the change, noting how authority need not shout to assert itself. Presence alone was imposing. As moments passed, whispers gave way to collective stillness. Every observer leaned in, attentive to the unfolding dynamic. There was no cheering, no dramatic gesture, only the slow accumulation of understanding. The anticipation was layered, both immediate and reflective. The crowd began to recognize a quiet inevitability, not in action, but in the trajectory of perception. The larger man was facing something he could not yet measure, and the space around him had begun to recalibrate. It was not merely tension between two men. It was tension between expectation and reality, between instinctive reliance on size and the subtle authority of mastery. Each spectator, consciously or not, became a witness to an unfolding hierarchy that relied on control, clarity, and anticipation rather than force. The room itself seemed to shrink, concentrating attention on these subtle exchanges, on the silent calculations that would soon dictate outcome. By the time the brief testing concluded, the psychological stage was fully set. The challenger, though still imposing in stature, carried a quiet weight of doubt. Bruce Lee, calm and observant, held the equilibrium. The inevitable confrontation loomed, not as spectacle, but as a precise unfolding of skill versus assumption, awareness versus expectation. The audience could already feel that what followed would not be measured in aggression or noise, but in timing, clarity, and the quiet collapse of overconfidence. The first movement was barely perceptible. The larger man shifted, testing distance, seeking to establish control. Bruce Lee mirrored nothing. He did not react outwardly. His posture remained relaxed, yet every inch of his body was attentive, tracking balance, timing, and intent. Observers noted the subtlety immediately. There was no flourish, no sudden strike. Instead, each movement was a study in restraint. Lee's foot adjusted, a minute pivot that realigned weight with economy and precision. His hand moved fractionally, not to attack, but to guide the encounter into inevitability. The larger opponent, expecting force to meet force, found himself slightly off balance, almost without realizing it. The exchange continued. A step forward, a shift in angle, a subtle repositioning of the arms. Each action from Lee served a purpose, each inaction equally intentional. The crowd began to recognize that what they were witnessing was not a battle, but a demonstration of clarity. The larger fighter's power was formidable, yet it was increasingly irrelevant against an opponent who required no brute strength to influence the course of events. A flick of the wrist, a measured step. These were enough to unsettle the challenger. He attempted to impose his size, to assert control through forward pressure, but Li's movements absorbed and redirected it effortlessly. The room held a quiet breath. Witnesses whispered later that it felt almost as if the larger man was acting against himself, compelled by timing and leverage he could not see. No one in the audience spoke. Silence amplified every detail. The soft scrape of a shoe on the mat, the shifting of weight, the subtle alignment of torso and hips. Every motion was both simple and decisive. Li's authority was not conveyed through aggression, but through the inevitability that each small movement carried. A controlled force that dictated consequence without overt effort. The larger man's expression began to change. Confidence, once steady, gave way to microsigns of hesitation. The gap between expectation and reality widened imperceptibly. With every precise adjustment from Li, the opponent's own momentum became unreliable, his gestures slower, more uncertain. The demonstration was complete not through the act of striking, but through the clarity and precision that rendered size secondary. By the end of this short but meticulous interaction, the outcome was unmistakable. The larger fighter faltered, a step too far, a balance slightly compromised. In that moment, control shifted. Bruce Li remained calm, standing upright, his presence unchanged. The demonstration had lasted only seconds in real time, yet it carried the weight of minutes in observation. The spectators understood that what they had seen was a quiet imposition of mastery. Skill dictating consequence without spectacle, authority asserting itself without noise. When the larger man stepped back, acknowledgement was unnecessary. The result was visible in posture, in the subtle easing of tension, in the room's collective recognition. There had been no struggle worth noting, no shouting, no dramatic clash. The demonstration had concluded with quiet inevitability. Mastery, subtle and efficient, had made its point. The larger man paused, a hesitation imperceptible to anyone untrained in close observation, yet unmistakable to those who had seen skill tested over years. His breath, once steady and assertive, now carried a faint unevenness. His posture shifted minutely, a subtle retreat from certainty toward doubt. The room, still silent, absorbed the change. It was not exhaustion that had arrived, it was recognition. Recognition that control, which had been assumed by size and reputation, could slip without the chaos of striking or shouting. Every movement Bruce Li had made, measured and precise, had imposed authority quietly, consistently and without aggression. The larger man's mind worked to reconcile expectation with reality. A presence so calm could bend action to consequence with a fraction of the effort he relied upon. Witnesses later recalled seeing the slow collapse of confidence as almost tangible. The challenger's gestures became smaller, more tentative. A step forward was recalculated. An arm lifted only partially. Even his gaze, once sweeping and commanding, lingered now on Li with a measure of uncertainty. Control, he realized, was not in force but in perception, timing, and clarity. The audience itself held a collective breath. There was no cheering, no outward acknowledgement. Yet every observer registered the shift. The lesson was not taught with words or demonstration boards. It was imprinted in posture, in hesitation, in the unspoken hierarchy revealed by observation. Power alone had no permanence when confronted with measured mastery. Bruce Li remained still, his calm a constant contrast. There was no triumph in his stance, no gesture to assert superiority. Mastery was not expressed through dominance but through its quiet effects. Each observer recognized that authority could operate invisibly, shaping outcomes not by overt struggle, but by clarity and precision. The larger man took another small step backward, more deliberate than before. The room registered it in silence. His internal struggle was no longer about the crowd, nor about reputation. It was an encounter with inevitability. Witnesses would later recall how the collapse was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet absolute. The shift had occurred in seconds, but the impression it left lingered for hours, days, and years. Even in stillness, Bruce Lee communicated a principle more enduring than any physical strike. Efficiency and understanding carried consequences far beyond strength or intimidation. Every subtle adjustment had a purpose. Every pause was intentional. By the time the confrontation concluded, the lesson had been absorbed without demonstration, spoken only by the inevitable result of clarity over expectation. The spectators, many of whom had never seen such skill applied so quietly, left with a shared understanding. The larger man's collapse was not shameful. It was instructive. And though few could articulate it at the moment, all recognized that what they had witnessed was a demonstration of authority far removed from noise or theatrics. Years later, the story persisted in quiet recollection. Those who had been present recounted it not for spectacle, but for the clarity it offered. The hall, the worn mats, and the beams remained largely unchanged. Yet the memory of that day lingered, carried in measured tones by witnesses who understood its significance. Bruce Lee's demonstration did not require repetition. Its lesson, delivered through precise observation rather than struggle, had endured. Practitioners referenced it when discussing mastery, not in terms of strength, but in timing, presence, and the subtle imposition of skill. The larger opponent, once confident in the primacy of size, retained a respect for the unseen consequences of clarity over force. The encounter left no resentment, only acknowledgement. The quiet demonstration had reshaped understanding. Over time, the event took on the weight of legend. It was recounted in hallways, in training rooms, and in casual conversation, each retelling careful to preserve the atmosphere of stillness and inevitability. No detail was exaggerated. The focus remained on the subtle shifts, the pause in movement, the recalibration of confidence, the silent assertion of mastery. Those who had witnessed it spoke of it almost reverently, aware that the story's power lay in its simplicity and its quiet authority. The impact extended beyond those present. Students and observers absorbed the lesson indirectly. That skill, when applied with precision and clarity, can outweigh expectation, reputation, and raw strength. Mastery need not be loud to be decisive. The psychological weight of observation, combined with understanding and efficiency, proved sufficient to redefine what it meant to confront a challenge. Even decades later, Bruce Lee's presence in that small hall was remembered as a study in subtle authority. The larger opponent's hesitation, the audience's silent absorption, the calm and deliberate execution of skill, all contributed to a legacy less about the physical outcome and more about the enduring principle it illustrated. Mastery is quiet, inevitable, and deeply influential when applied without waste. The room, long after the confrontation, seemed to hold the memory of that day. Witnesses who returned to train there remarked on the air of measured attention that lingered, the quiet respect embedded in the space itself. It was not myth for myth's sake. It was legend grounded in observation, a record of human behavior, perception, and disciplined mastery. In the end, the story persisted not because of a moment of strength or aggression, but because of the subtle power of quiet clarity. The event had concluded in seconds, yet its imprint stretched across years, shaping understanding, influencing practice, and quietly asserting the principle that mastery, calm and deliberate, leaves a mark far more enduring than spectacle.